The ocean never lies. The words landed in the boardroom like a stone dropped into still water. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned. At the far end of the polished walnut conference table, Nathan Cole slowly rose from his seat, clutching a weathered folder that looked strangely out of place among the sleek tablets and glowing presentation screens. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston Harbor shimmered beneath a gray afternoon sky. Inside, $12 million was about to change hands. The executives of Atlantic Mutual Insurance sat surrounded by spreadsheets, legal opinions, and engineering reports. The claim had already survived weeks of scrutiny. The luxury yacht Aurora Belle, a vessel worth more than most neighborhoods, had supposedly been destroyed during a violent offshore storm. Every consultant agreed. Every marine surveyor agreed. Every attorney agreed. The payout was considered inevitable. The company's CEO adjusted his silver tie and prepared to sign the final authorization. Reporters were already gathering in the lobby downstairs. By sunset, the case would be closed. But Nathan Cole was still standing. No one in the room considered him important enough to interrupt. He was not an executive. He was not an attorney. He did not have a corner office overlooking the harbor. He was an insurance claims clerk who spent most of his days buried beneath paperwork, reviewing files that nobody else wanted to read. Most people in the company barely knew his name. Yet something in his expression caused an uncomfortable silence to settle over the room. "Mr. Cole," the CEO finally asked, "do you have something to add?" A few people exchanged amused glances. One attorney leaned back in his chair, already smiling. Nathan looked down at the documents in his hands. The folder was thick with weather charts, tide records, shipping reports, and handwritten notes. For 3 nights, he had barely slept. For 3 nights, he had stared at numbers until they blurred together. And every time he reviewed the evidence, the same conclusion emerged. The official story made no sense. He lifted his eyes toward the giant image displayed on the conference screen. It showed the Aurora Belle drifting helplessly through rough seas before its reported loss. A tragic accident. A perfect narrative. A multimillion-dollar disaster. The yacht never encountered the storm described in the claim, Nathan said quietly. Several executives laughed. One of the attorneys shook his head. That storm was confirmed by the Coast Guard. And by 3 independent experts, another added. Nathan nodded. "I know." The room relaxed. They assumed he was about to sit back down. Instead, he opened the folder. But the ocean doesn't support their conclusion. The laughter stopped. Outside, a ferry moved slowly across the harbor, leaving a white trail through dark water. Nathan placed a single page onto the conference table. It contained only a handful of numbers and a faded map of coastal currents. Simple, unremarkable. Yet the moment he discovered it, everything had changed. Because somewhere hidden beneath millions of dollars in reports and testimony, the sea itself had left behind a contradiction. And if Nathan was right, one of the most expensive yacht accidents in company history had never been an accident at all. 3 days earlier, Nathan Cole had been sitting alone beneath the cold fluorescent lights of Claims Department B, a forgotten corner of Atlantic Mutual where the carpets were worn thin and the coffee always tasted slightly burnt. Outside his small window, Boston Harbor disappeared beneath a curtain of rain, but inside, the office had already begun winding down for the evening. Most employees had gone home. The elevators had grown quiet. Cleaning crews moved through the hallways like silent shadows. Nathan was preparing to leave when a thick file landed on his desk with a heavy thud. The red stamp across the cover immediately caught his attention. Priority claim. He sighed and pulled the folder closer. Cases involving luxury vessels were usually assigned to senior investigators, but staffing shortages had pushed several preliminary reviews onto lower-level clerks. To everyone else, it was routine paperwork. To Nathan, it was another long night. He opened the file and found photographs of the Aurora Belle. The yacht looked less like a boat and more like a floating mansion, 160 feet long. For guest decks, imported Italian marble, custom glass observation lounge. The vessel had belonged to Graham Whitmore, a real estate developer whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and charity galas. According to the report, the yacht had been caught in a severe storm nearly 80 miles offshore. The damage estimate exceeded $11 million. Attached statements from marine consultants all pointed to the same conclusion. Natural disaster. Unavoidable loss. Case closed. Nathan flipped through hundreds of pages. Survey reports, insurance declarations, Coast Guard summaries, satellite images. Everything appeared perfectly organized, almost too organized. He could not explain why the feeling bothered him. He simply knew it did. Years earlier, his grandfather had worked as a harbor master along the New England coast. As a child, Nathan had spent countless weekends listening to stories about tides, weather patterns, and the strange ways the ocean revealed the truth to those willing to observe it carefully. Most people forgot details. The sea remembered them. Nathan continued reading. Midnight came and went. The office grew silent except for the hum of air vents overhead. Then he noticed something unusual. A weather summary referenced wind speeds that seemed inconsistent with the vessel's reported drift pattern. It was a tiny discrepancy, so small that most people would have ignored it. Nathan nearly did. Yet the numbers lingered in his mind long after he closed the page. Curious, he opened archived weather records from the date of the accident. Then he checked ocean current reports. Then tidal charts. 1 hour turned into 2. 2 became 4. The deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. Every official conclusion appeared correct when viewed separately. Together, however, they formed a picture that felt slightly distorted, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. Just before dawn, Nathan leaned back in his chair and stared at the harbor beyond the glass. The rain had stopped. Gray morning light reflected across the water, and for the first time, a possibility entered his mind that refused to leave. What if the yacht had not ended up where nature would have taken it at all? By mid-morning, Nathan found himself staring at a collection of photographs spread across his desk. Most people would have seen nothing more than damaged fiberglass, bent railings, and seawater-stained interiors. He saw questions. The Aurora Belle had once been the crown jewel of Whitmore Marine Holdings, a vessel so extravagant that local newspapers had covered its unveiling like a celebrity event. The yacht's white exterior gleamed beneath Florida sunshine in every promotional photograph. Guests had gathered on polished teak decks. Crystal glasses reflected golden sunsets. Every detail projected effortless wealth. Yet as Nathan studied the insurance file, he became increasingly fascinated by the world surrounding the vessel. Graham Whitmore was not simply wealthy. He was influential. His waterfront developments stretched across multiple states. His name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and charity foundations. When he entered a room, people listened. When he made a claim, people rarely questioned it. The yacht itself reflected that status. Imported stone lined its interior floors. Handcrafted woodwork decorated private lounges. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around observation decks designed to offer uninterrupted views of the Atlantic. Every photograph in the file seemed determined to communicate the same message. Success, prestige, power. Nathan understood why the claim had moved so quickly through the approval process. Nobody expected someone like Graham Whitmore to fabricate a story. The assumption of credibility surrounded him like an invisible shield. Still, the deeper Nathan looked, the more that shield began to crack. He enlarged one image showing the vessel shortly before the reported accident. The yacht sat anchored near a private marina, its hull perfectly clean, its navigation equipment recently serviced. Another photograph showed weather conditions from the same week. Calm water, moderate winds, clear visibility. Nothing unusual. Nathan opened a marine traffic database and reviewed the vessel's movements. The route appeared ordinary. Then he compared those coordinates against archived weather maps once more. The discrepancy returned. Small, persistent, impossible to ignore. Outside his office window, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting silver reflections across Boston Harbor. Nathan rubbed his tired eyes. Most people believed investigations were built upon dramatic discoveries. In reality, they were often built upon tiny doubts that refused to disappear. He remembered something his grandfather once told him while watching fishing boats return to port. Wealth can buy a beautiful ship, but it cannot convince the tide to flow in the wrong direction. At the time, Nathan had laughed. Now those words echoed in his mind. He looked again at the reported drift path included in the claim package. According to the official narrative, storm conditions had pushed the vessel toward the location where it was eventually discovered. Every expert had accepted that explanation. Yet every current chart Nathan reviewed suggested something entirely different. The ocean should have carried the yacht elsewhere, not a few hundred feet elsewhere. Miles away. The difference was enormous, large enough to change everything. Nathan leaned forward and marked another note in the margin of his folder. The room around him remained quiet. Telephones rang in distant departments. Printers hummed somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary workday. Yet hidden among weather records and navigation reports, a far more extraordinary story was beginning to emerge. And for the first time, Nathan realized that if he continued following the evidence, he might find himself standing alone against people far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Nathan spent the rest of the day trying to convince himself he was overthinking the case. It would have been easier that way. Easier to accept the conclusions already reached by marine engineers, legal teams, and independent consultants. Easier to close the file and move on to the next claim waiting in the growing stack on his desk. But every time he tried, the same question returned. If the ocean currents were wrong, what else was wrong? The following morning, he arrived at the office before sunrise. The city outside was still wrapped in pale blue darkness when he unlocked the records room on the lower level of the building. Few employees ever visited the archive. Most preferred digital databases and searchable reports. Nathan preferred original documents. Old records had a habit of preserving details that modern summaries overlooked. The archive smelled faintly of paper, dust, and aging cardboard. Metal shelves stretched across the room beneath fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. He requested every available document connected to the vessel's route, maintenance history, and marina departures during the month leading up to the reported accident. Hours passed as he reviewed inspection reports and fuel receipts. Most revealed nothing unusual. Then, shortly after lunch, he found something strange. A photograph attached to a routine marina service report showed the vessel docked 3 days before the incident. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Yet Nathan noticed a heavy mooring line extending from the stern at an angle that seemed inconsistent with the yacht's documented position. He enlarged the image and studied it carefully. The line was attached to equipment not listed anywhere in the official reports. It might have been insignificant. It might have been completely innocent. Yet it added another small question to a file already filled with them. Nathan printed the image and placed it beside his weather charts. The pattern was growing. Tiny inconsistencies, independent details, each one easy to dismiss alone. Together they formed something harder to ignore. Late that afternoon, his supervisor, Daniel Mercer, stopped by his cubicle. Daniel was a practical man who measured success by efficiency. He glanced at the stacks of documents surrounding Nathan and frowned. "You are still reviewing that yacht claim?" he asked. Nathan nodded. "I think there are unresolved issues." Daniel looked toward the conference rooms lining the harbor side of the building. "That file is nearly approved. The executives want it closed this week." Nathan hesitated. "What if the evidence does not support the conclusion?" Daniel offered a polite smile. "Then let the investigators handle it. That is why we pay them." With that, he walked away. Nathan watched him disappear around the corner. The response was not cruel. It was not dismissive. It was simply the opinion of someone who trusted established authority. Most people did. Nathan once had as well. As evenings settled over Boston Harbor, golden reflections shimmered across the water outside his window. He gathered the photographs, weather maps, and current charts into a single folder. The discrepancies were no longer isolated. They were beginning to connect. And somewhere beyond the paperwork, beyond the wealth and influence surrounding the claim, Nathan had the growing sense that someone had carefully constructed a story designed to look flawless. The problem was that nature rarely cooperated with manufactured stories. And the ocean, unlike people, could not be persuaded to lie. The next morning, Nathan made a decision that would have seemed ridiculous to most of his coworkers. Instead of focusing on the damage reports, he began focusing on everything surrounding them. If someone wanted a false story to survive scrutiny, they would make the center of the story appear perfect. The mistakes would hide around the edges. He started with marina records. Hundreds of pages. Departure logs. Fuel deliveries. Maintenance invoices. Crew certifications. Most investigators had already reviewed them. Nathan reviewed them again. Late in the afternoon, he discovered something unusual buried inside a vendor invoice. 3 weeks before the reported accident, specialized towing equipment had been delivered to a private dock leased by one of Whitmore's holding companies. The equipment itself was not suspicious. Wealthy yacht owners frequently rented specialized marine equipment. What caught Nathan's attention was the timing. The rental period ended only 4 days after the yacht was supposedly lost. He pulled additional records. Then more. The deeper he looked, the stranger the timeline became. According to official statements, severe weather had left the vessel disabled and drifting uncontrollably. Yet several service records suggested preparations that appeared deliberate rather than emergency-related. Nathan spread documents across his desk until there was barely room for his keyboard. Outside, the harbor reflected a bright autumn afternoon. Inside, his small cubicle looked like the command center of a detective no one knew existed. At 5 o'clock, employees began heading home. Conversations faded. Elevator doors opened and closed. Within an hour, most of the floor was empty. Nathan remained. He compared dates, signatures, locations, and weather conditions. One detail led to another. Another led to a third. None proved fraud. Not yet. But together they formed a growing chain of questions. Shortly before 7 o'clock, an email appeared in his inbox. It came from a legal assistant involved with the claim. The message was brief and polite. Final approval, meeting scheduled Friday. Supporting documentation complete. Claim recommended for immediate settlement. Nathan stared at the screen. Friday was only 2 days away. Once the money moved, the investigation would effectively end. He leaned back and looked across the darkening harbor. The city lights were beginning to appear one by one. Ferries crossed the water like moving stars. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps the inconsistencies were coincidences. Perhaps dozens of experts had reached the correct conclusion and he was simply wasting time. Then he looked again at the current charts pinned beside his desk. The numbers remained unchanged. Nature was consistent. Facts were consistent. And the facts still refused to align with the official story. Nathan gathered his papers and slid them into a growing folder that had become much thicker than the original claim file. As he prepared to leave, his eyes stopped on one particular document. A maintenance record referenced a coastal harbor nearly 80 miles from the reported accident site. It was a minor note that most readers would overlook in seconds. Nathan read it 3 times. Then a fourth. Slowly, a new possibility began taking shape. If that record meant what he thought it meant, the yacht's final location might not have been determined by weather at all. It might have been determined by people. The next day, Nathan could not shake the feeling that the maintenance record was pointing towards something important. Before heading to the office, he stopped at a small harbor cafe overlooking the waterfront. Fishing boats rocked gently against weathered docks while gulls circled overhead. The morning air carried the scent of salt and diesel fuel. Nathan sat alone with a notebook and a cup of coffee, reviewing the timeline once again. Wealthy yacht owners often moved vessels between marinas. That alone meant nothing. But the location mentioned in the record continued to bother him. The harbor was positioned in a way that created a very different interaction with prevailing currents than the area where the accident supposedly occurred. If the yacht had been there shortly before the incident, the official narrative became far more difficult to explain. By the time he reached Atlantic Mutual, a new determination had settled over him. He opened maritime databases, historical navigation reports, and satellite imagery. Hour after hour, he followed every lead connected to the vessel's movements. Most roads ended nowhere. Then, shortly after noon, he found another inconsistency. A harbor service contractor had logged activity involving equipment capable of moving large vessels under controlled conditions. The entry was brief. No explanation. No obvious connection to the claim. Yet the date once again fell uncomfortably close to the reported loss. Nathan stared at the screen. The same pattern kept repeating. Tiny details. Small enough to avoid attention. Significant enough to create questions. He printed the record and added it to the growing collection spread across his desk. The pile now included current maps, weather summaries, marina invoices, fuel records, maintenance schedules, and photographs. To anyone walking by, it probably looked chaotic. To Nathan, the pieces were slowly beginning to align. Later that afternoon, he requested access to archived coastal navigation data from several years earlier. The system returned thousands of entries. Most employees would have given up immediately. Nathan kept searching. He remembered his grandfather teaching him that important truths rarely announced themselves. They hid beneath ordinary details, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. As evening approached, he found himself studying old harbor records maintained by local maritime authorities. Many had been digitized decades after their creation. The documents were dry and technical, filled with coordinates, weather observations, and handwritten annotations. Yet among them, Nathan discovered references to ocean behavior that were remarkably consistent over time. Currents shifted, tides rose and fell, but certain patterns repeated year after year with remarkable reliability. That realization sparked a new idea. If modern reports could be manipulated or misinterpreted, older records might provide an independent benchmark, a source untouched by the insurance claim itself. As darkness settled outside, Nathan saved a list of coastal archives and maritime libraries that might hold additional historical material. The official evidence still pointed toward an accident. Yet every new layer he uncovered made that explanation feel less convincing. Somewhere beyond the polished reports and expert conclusions, another story was waiting. And Nathan was beginning to suspect that the key to finding it might not be hidden in modern technology at all. It might be hidden in something much older. The following morning, Nathan took a personal day for the first time in nearly a year. Officially, he was using accumulated vacation hours. Unofficially, he was chasing a question that refused to leave him alone. A cold wind swept across the waterfront as he drove north along the coast toward a small maritime museum tucked beside an aging harbor. It was the kind of place most tourists ignored. Weathered wooden docks stretched into gray water. Fishing vessels bobbed gently against their moorings. Salt air lingered over everything. Inside, the museum felt frozen in time. Glass cases displayed brass compasses, faded charts, and journals kept by captains long before satellites and digital navigation existed. Nathan introduced himself to an elderly archivist named Walter Briggs, a retired harbor pilot, whose family had worked the coastline for generations. Walter listened patiently as Nathan explained his interest in historical current records. Most visitors asked about shipwrecks or famous voyages. Nathan was asking about tides from decades ago. That alone earned a curious smile. Walter led him through narrow aisles lined with shelves of aging binders and handwritten maritime logs. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight. The room smelled of paper, cedar, and salt. Hours passed as Nathan reviewed record after record. Most confirmed what he already knew. The ocean followed patterns. Not perfectly, not predictably every day, but closely enough that experienced sailors could often anticipate its behavior years in advance. Then, shortly after 3 o'clock, Walter placed a thick, leather-bound logbook on the table. The cover was cracked from age. Its corners were worn smooth by countless hands. This belonged to a harbor master who tracked local current shifts for nearly 40 years, Walter explained. Most people never bother looking at it. Nathan carefully opened the book. The handwriting inside was neat and meticulous. Every page contained observations about tides, weather systems, and current behavior along the same coastal region connected to the insurance claim. At first, the entries seemed routine. Then he noticed something remarkable. The current patterns recorded over decades matched the modern charts he had been studying almost perfectly. Nathan turned pages faster. Entry after entry confirmed the same thing. During weather conditions similar to those reported in the claim, vessels drifting without assistance would consistently move in one direction. Yet according to the official accident report, the yacht had ended up somewhere entirely different. He checked the coordinates again. Then again, the discrepancy remained. Walter noticed the intensity in Nathan's expression. "Find something interesting?" he asked. Nathan did not answer immediately. He was staring at a particular entry written nearly 30 years earlier. The harbor master had recorded an unusual drift event involving a disabled vessel. The route described in the log mirrored the conditions surrounding the modern claim almost exactly. The outcome was completely opposite to the yacht's reported movement. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. For the first time, he was no longer relying on theories. He was holding independent evidence created decades before the yacht ever existed. Evidence that suggested the vessel could not have reached its reported location through natural forces alone. Somewhere between the polished legal reports and the quiet wisdom preserved inside an old maritime logbook, the truth had begun to surface. And that truth was becoming harder to ignore with every page he turned. When Nathan returned to Boston that evening, The old maritime logbook rode beside him on the passenger seat in a protective archive case Walter had agreed to lend for 48 hours. The city skyline glowed against the dark water as he crossed the harbor bridge, but his attention remained fixed on the evidence now sitting inches away. For days he had been chasing suspicions. Now he possessed something far more valuable. He possessed independent confirmation. The next morning, he arrived at Atlantic Mutual before sunrise. The office was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems. He spread the logbook across a conference table and began comparing every relevant entry against modern weather records. Hour after hour, he built spreadsheets, diagrams, and current models. The results were astonishingly consistent. Whether he examined data from 30 years ago or data from 3 months ago, the outcome never changed. Under the reported weather conditions, an unpowered vessel should have drifted southwest. The yacht had been discovered northeast, not slightly northeast, not close enough to blame measurement error. Entirely northeast. It was the equivalent of a compass pointing in the wrong direction. Nathan stared at the maps covering the table. A slow realization settled over him. If nature could not explain the vessel's final location, then someone else had to. Around noon, he requested additional harbor surveillance records connected to nearby marinas. Most cameras automatically deleted footage after a limited period, but archived activity logs remained. The request triggered several hours of waiting. While the system processed, Nathan continued reviewing the yacht's timeline. Every official report focused on the storm. Almost none focused on the days immediately before it. That gap now felt deliberate. Shortly after 3 o'clock, the archived records arrived. Nathan opened them carefully. Hundreds of entries appeared. Fuel deliveries, service vessels, harbor departures, routine traffic. Then one entry caught his attention. A support vessel registered to a subcontractor had operated unusually close to the area linked to the claim. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Yet the timing aligned almost perfectly with the period between the yacht's last verified position and its reported discovery. Nathan felt his pulse quicken. He pulled the maintenance records beside the surveillance logs. Then he added the towing equipment invoice. Then the current charts. For the first time, multiple independent sources pointed toward the same possibility. The yacht may not have drifted to its final location. It may have been relocated there. He stood and walked toward the harbor-facing windows. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the water below. Ferries moved through shipping lanes. Tugboats guided cargo vessels toward distant terminals. Everywhere he looked, people were moving things through the ocean, guiding them, positioning them, controlling them. The idea suddenly seemed obvious. Oceans created opportunities. Experienced operators knew how to use them. Nathan returned to the table and studied the evidence once more. The story was beginning to reveal itself. Not completely, not yet, but enough to expose a dangerous weakness in the official narrative. Somewhere behind the claim, behind the wealth and influence surrounding it, someone had counted on nobody asking how a yacht ended up exactly where the ocean would never have taken it. That evening, Nathan stayed long after the rest of the department had gone home. The cleaning staff passed through the hallways. Office lights switched off one section at a time. Beyond the glass walls, overlooking Boston Harbor, darkness settled across the water. Yet the conference table remained covered with charts, photographs, invoices, navigation records, and pages copied from the old maritime logbook. For nearly a week, he had been gathering fragments. Now he needed to determine whether those fragments truly belonged to the same story. He began building a complete timeline. Not the timeline presented in the insurance claim, but a timeline based entirely on independent evidence. He started with the yacht's last confirmed marina departure. Then he added fuel purchases, maintenance records, harbor activity logs, weather reports, ocean current models. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Nathan traced the sequence with a pencil. Every event appeared reasonable until he reached the period immediately before the reported accident. There, the story began to bend. According to the official account, severe weather had left the vessel at the mercy of the sea. Yet the current data told a different story. The ocean should have carried the yacht in one direction. The vessel appeared somewhere else entirely. He checked the numbers again. Then again. The result never changed. Around 9 o'clock, he opened a marine simulation program used by investigators. He entered the exact weather conditions documented during the incident. Wind speed, wave height, Tide information. Current direction. Then he launched the model. A digital marker representing the vessel began drifting across a map. Nathan watched carefully. The marker moved southwest. Exactly as expected. He ran the simulation a second time. Southwest again. A third time. The same result. He adjusted variables. Tested alternate conditions. Introduced minor errors. Every scenario produced nearly identical outcomes. Not one brought the vessel close to its reported discovery location. Nathan leaned back slowly. For the first time, the conclusion felt unavoidable. The yacht had not simply ended up in the wrong place. It had ended up in a place that natural forces could not reasonably explain. A chill ran through him as he stared at the glowing map on his screen. Someone had counted on nobody performing this comparison. Someone had assumed the weather reports alone would be enough. The realization transformed the entire case. Up until that moment, Nathan had been investigating inconsistencies. Now he was investigating intent. He stood and walked toward the harbor windows. Cargo ships moved silently beneath scattered lights. Tugboats guided larger vessels through dark channels. The sight reminded him of something simple yet important. Large objects on the water rarely moved by accident. They moved because people made decisions. When he returned to the table, his eyes settled on the maintenance record from the distant harbor and the towing equipment invoice beside it. Suddenly, they no longer looked like unrelated details. They looked like pieces of a mechanism. A mechanism designed to place a multimillion-dollar vessel exactly where someone wanted it to be. And if Nathan was right, the most important question was no longer whether the official story was false. The question was who had built it. Friday arrived beneath a blanket of low-gray clouds drifting across Boston Harbor. The final approval meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. By noon, if everything proceeded according to plan, millions of dollars would leave Atlantic Mutual and the file would be permanently closed. Nathan arrived carrying a single binder. Unlike the executives preparing presentations and legal summaries, he carried no polished reports and no expensive briefing materials. Inside his binder were copies of weather charts, harbor records, maintenance invoices, simulation results, and selected pages from the old maritime logbook. The evidence was simple. That was what made it powerful. At 8:30, he reserved a small conference room and spent the next hour organizing every piece into a sequence that anyone could follow. He knew the challenge was no longer discovering the truth. The challenge was proving it in a way that could not be ignored. Shortly before the meeting began, he received another surprise. A marine consultant who had helped validate the original claim released a supplemental statement reaffirming the accident narrative. The document was professional, detailed, and convincing. For a moment, Nathan felt uncertainty creep back into his mind. The consultant possessed decades of experience. The executives trusted him completely. What if Nathan had overlooked something important? He sat quietly and reviewed the evidence one final time. The weather records still pointed in the same direction. The current models still produced the same outcome. The historical logbook still contradicted the official story. Most importantly, the independent records all agreed with one another despite originating from completely different sources. The facts remained unchanged. At 9:50, employees began filing into the large harbor conference room. Attorneys arranged folders across polished tables. Executives discussed settlement procedures. Through the glass walls, Boston Harbor stretched beneath a silver sky. Ferries crossed the water below. Everything felt calm, ordered, certain. Nathan entered last and took a seat near the end of the table. No one paid much attention. Several people nodded politely before returning to their conversations. They expected the meeting to be routine. They expected signatures and final approvals. They expected the case to end. The CEO opened the session and reviewed the claim summary. The figures were substantial. The supporting evidence appeared extensive. One by one, department heads confirmed their recommendations. Legal approved. Risk assessment approved. External consultants approved. The settlement appeared moments away from authorization. Then the CEO glanced toward the room. "Any final concerns?" he asked. Silence followed. Nathan felt his heart pounding. This was the moment. The point where weeks of work would either matter or disappear forever. Slowly he stood. Several executives looked surprised. Others appeared confused. One attorney checked his notes as if trying to remember Nathan's name. The room grew quiet. Nathan opened the binder and placed several documents onto the conference table. "I have a concern," he said calmly. A few people exchanged amused expressions. One executive leaned back in his chair. Another looked toward the clock. They expected a minor procedural question. Nothing more. Nathan looked around the room before speaking again. "The evidence shows that the vessel could not have reached its reported location through the weather conditions described in this claim." The room became still, and for the first time, every person at the table was listening. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Then a low chuckle came from the opposite side of the table. One of the senior attorneys smiled politely and folded his hands. "With respect, Mr. Cole," he said, "multiple marine experts have already reviewed these findings." A few heads nodded. The confidence in the room began returning. Nathan expected that reaction. He opened the binder and slid the first chart across the table. "This is the official weather report." Then he placed a second document beside it. "These are the corresponding current patterns." He pointed to a series of highlighted coordinates. Every expert focused on the storm. Almost nobody focused on where the ocean would actually carry a disabled vessel. The marine consultant adjusted his glasses and examined the charts. "Ocean movement is complex," he replied. "There are countless variables." "Agreed," Nathan said calmly. "Which is why I tested dozens of scenarios." He connected his laptop to the conference screen. A map appeared, then a simulation. Wind data, current direction, tide information. The same model he had run repeatedly during the previous week. The digital vessel began drifting across the display. Southwest. The room watched quietly. Nathan started a second simulation. Southwest again, then a third. The result barely changed. Nobody laughed this time. The consultant leaned forward. One executive exchanged a glance with another. Nathan continued. "The yacht was reportedly discovered northeast of its last verified position. Yet every independent model predicts movement in the opposite direction." The CEO frowned. "How significant is the difference?" Nathan clicked to the next slide. The map zoomed outward. Several people visibly straightened in their chairs. The gap was not minor. It stretched across miles of coastline. "This is not a rounding error," Nathan said. "This is a completely different destination." The room grew quiet again. Then, another voice entered the discussion. Graham Whitmore himself had joined remotely through a large video screen mounted on the wall. Until now, he had remained mostly silent. His expression was calm and confident. "Are you suggesting the ocean ignored established science?" he asked. Nathan met his gaze. "No, I am suggesting the ocean followed science perfectly." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Nathan clicked again. The image of the old maritime logbook appeared on the screen. A few people looked confused. Others appeared skeptical. Nathan explained where it came from and why it mattered. Then he displayed historical observations recorded decades before the claim existed. The entries matched the modern current patterns with remarkable consistency. "This source has no connection to the insurance company, no connection to the yacht, no connection to any financial outcome," Nathan said. "Yet it predicts the same movement as every modern data set." The consultant's confidence began fading. He requested copies of the records. Nathan handed them over immediately. For several minutes, pages turned. Calculators appeared. Notes were taken. The atmosphere in the room changed. Slowly, noticeably, what had started as skepticism was becoming concern. Then Nathan revealed the final timeline. Maintenance records, equipment rentals, harbor activity logs, independent surveillance entries. One by one, the pieces connected into a single sequence. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. And when Nathan finally stepped back from the screen, the room no longer looked at him as a claims clerk sitting at the end of the table. They looked at him as the person who had just exposed a question none of them could answer. The meeting did not end with a signature. It ended with silence. The CEO looked from the evidence on the table to the executives surrounding him. The confidence that had filled the room an hour earlier was gone. In its place stood uncertainty, questions, concern. One by one, department leaders reviewed the documents again. The marine consultant requested access to Nathan's underlying calculations. The legal team asked for copies of the harbor records and simulation outputs. Nobody spoke about approving the claim anymore. That conversation had disappeared entirely. Even Graham Whitmore's expression on the video screen had changed. The easy confidence that accompanied wealth and influence had been replaced by careful restraint. He insisted that the claim was legitimate. He questioned the interpretation of the evidence. He emphasized the conclusions reached by previous experts. Yet every response seemed weaker than the facts already sitting on the conference table. The CEO finally raised a hand. The settlement is suspended pending further review. The words landed with extraordinary weight. Millions of dollars stopped moving with a single sentence. Several attorneys immediately began discussing procedural requirements. Independent investigators would be brought in. Additional maritime specialists would examine the findings. Regulatory authorities would receive copies of the updated evidence package. What had been considered a closed case was suddenly wide open again. Nathan remained seated as the room erupted into activity. For days he had imagined this moment. He expected relief. Instead, he felt strangely calm. The evidence had done exactly what evidence was supposed to do. It had forced people to look closer. Nothing more. Nothing less. Over the next several weeks, investigators expanded their review. Additional records were requested from marinas, contractors, and service providers connected to the vessel. Independent experts recreated the drift analysis. They reviewed the weather data. They examined the current models. Again and again, they reached the same conclusion Nathan had reached alone at his desk. The reported location of the yacht could not be explained by natural conditions. New findings continued to emerge. Harbor records revealed inconsistencies. Equipment usage records raised further questions. Timeline discrepancies became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Eventually, authorities concluded that the claim contained material inaccuracies significant enough to halt all payment activity and trigger a broader inquiry. The proposed settlement was formally denied. News of the decision spread quickly throughout the insurance industry. Trade publications covered the story. Maritime analysts debated the findings. Professionals who had never heard of Nathan Cole suddenly found themselves discussing the claim's clerk who had questioned a multimillion-dollar case everyone else believed was finished. Yet the moment that stayed with Nathan occurred weeks later on a quiet afternoon overlooking Boston Harbor. He stood by the same window where he had spent countless hours reviewing weather reports and current charts. Cargo ships moved steadily through the channels below. The ocean looked exactly as it always had. Unimpressed by wealth. Unaffected by reputation. Unmoved by assumptions. The sea had never hidden the truth. People simply failed to ask the right questions. And in the end, a forgotten logbook, a handful of weather records, and the persistence of one overlooked employee had accomplished something no expensive report could accomplish. They had forced the truth to surface. Months later, life at Atlantic Mutual looked remarkably different. The harbor still shimmered beneath the morning sun. Ferries still crossed the water. Executives still hurried through glass hallways carrying reports and deadlines. Yet one thing had changed. People had learned that important answers could come from unexpected places. Nathan Cole never became the loudest person in the building. He never sought attention. He never appeared on magazine covers or financial television programs. In many ways, he remained exactly who he had always been. He arrived early. He reviewed files carefully. He asked questions others overlooked. But now, when he spoke, people listened. The company created new review procedures inspired by the investigation. Analysts were encouraged to challenge assumptions. Junior employees were invited into discussions that previously belonged only to senior leadership. The lesson spread far beyond a single insurance claim. It became part of the company's culture. One afternoon, the CEO stopped by Nathan's office. The same office that overlooked a narrow stretch of harbor water. The same desk where countless hours had been spent studying weather reports and current charts. He handed Nathan a small framed photograph. It showed the old maritime logbook resting beside modern navigation records. Beneath the image was a simple inscription. Facts do not care about titles. Nathan smiled. Of all the recognition he had received, that one meant the most. A few weeks later, he returned to the Coastal Museum where his search had truly changed direction. Walter Briggs greeted him with the same warm smile. Together they stood near the docks watching fishing boats move across the bay. Nathan told him how the investigation had concluded. Walter listened quietly before looking toward the horizon. Funny thing about the ocean, he said. Most people think it hides secrets. Usually it does the opposite. It reveals them. You just have to know where to look. Nathan looked out across the water. The old harbor master who filled those pages decades ago had never known his observations would help expose the truth years later. Yet that was the beauty of honest work. Knowledge endured. Integrity endured. Careful attention endured. Long after wealth, influence, and assumptions faded away. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, golden light spread across the waves. The water moved exactly as it always had, following rules older than any company, any reputation, or any fortune. In the end, the story had never been about a yacht or a claim. It had been about something much simpler. The truth often leaves clues in plain sight. Most people walk past them. A few take the time to notice. And sometimes, one overlooked person willing to ask one extra question can change the outcome of everything. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this story and believe that integrity, perseverance, and careful thinking still matter, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who would appreciate it, and subscribing to the channel for more stories that remind us that real value is measured not by status, but by character.